Species. Unite.
People in the animal welfare world, I think, should broaden their purview to the human parts of it and sort of work in coalition. Like if you can really expose the labor conditions, you're weakening the industry. And if you can increase labor regulations, if you can make it to where workers don't, routinely get repetitive stress injuries, if they're not breathing in harsh chemicals, if you slow the kill line down, that hits their profits, and you are weakening the industry. And also just, remember that, this industry doesn't slaughter, I don't know how many billions of animals. It doesn't just slaughter billions of animals a year. It also makes life hell for the people who work in it, and expand your level of solidarity to those people.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you liked today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. This is the third episode in a special 4-part series where we go deep into the food system with some of the brightest minds at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Today, we dig into one of the many hidden and hideous aspects of our food system, the exploitation of workers in industrial meat production. This conversation is with Tom Philpott. Tom is a journalist, an author, and a senior researcher at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. He has spent decades reporting on the injustices and ecological ramifications of the industrial food system, most recently at Mother Jones, and he is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Perilous Bounty. I asked Tom to come on to shed some light on the grueling conditions faced by meatpacking workers, from dangerous line speeds to repetitive injuries and the shocking lack of basic protections. And even though much of this was exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, somehow it's all still happening. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
It's really good to be here and to do this today. So thank you for having me.
Welcome to Baltimore, and we're happy to have you.
Thank you. Why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and how CLF became where you are now and what you do here?
So I was a journalist for a long time, and I still do some journalism. I still freelance a little bit. I've been covering sort of the food politics beat since about 2005. And in that time of covering the beat, first at Grist and then at Mother Jones, CLF is an institution that kept coming up. And I also wrote a book that came out in 2020 that took an incredible amount of work. And it was an incredibly difficult time for me in my personal life for a couple of reasons. I decided that when it came out, I would sort of recalibrate and see what else I could do where I'm still in this world of, looking at food policy, looking at the food industry from a critical lens, but not have constant deadlines, be involved in sort of high-level conversations about policy. But my book came out during the pandemic. And I think this is going to get us back. This is going to be a good segue into workers.
Yeah.
So my book comes out in August of 2020.
Perilous Bounty.
Perilous Bounty. And it's not about workers. It's about some of the ecological ramifications of the food system. So, the few months before your book is coming out, you're sort of like thinking about the, publicity for it and stuff like that. All of that was off the table. The pandemic hits in March, April 2020. And I got really excited about journalism because, the basic story that got me was that meatpacking workers were essentially being unprotected. They were in a position where they're working cheek by jowl in these facilities. They're working really close together. Social distancing is not on the table for them. The rest of us are able to, a lot of people are able to work from home and protect themselves. There are this group of workers that don't get that privilege. And immediately you can see the coronavirus taking root in these facilities, people getting sick, and the line just keeps churning and churning. And so I just, dove right back in, got really excited about it, wrote a lot in those first few months did a bunch of articles on meatpacking workers in the pandemic, other essential workers in the pandemic. And that took me until about 2022. Then I was exhausted again and started looking around, like, what else can I do where I can continue to be involved with this work? I can continue to do journalism, but I can do it in a less intensive way and have more time to think and more time to spend on writing. And I'm not writing so much that I just feel like I'm just squeezing myself out like an orange. And just started having conversations, and CLF emerged as a possible home for me. And I'm very glad that it did.
What do you do at CLF?
I do a few different things. We do a podcast that is called Unconfined Podcast. And in Unconfined, it's only monthly, but we talk to someone who is involved in some level with the critique of industrial livestock production, industrial food animal production, or involved in developing alternatives to it. Our very first interview was with a woman named Sherry White Williamson, who is an activist in Eastern North Carolina, where they've put this tremendous amount of industrial hog production in these historically Black communities. And she just, gave in that episode a really sort of comprehensive view from the ground of what it means to be on the wrong side of this industry, where you literally live among, millions of hogs and all their waste. And so, I want someone who's like working on the worker angle, or someone who's working on the sort of, pollution of the Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone that develops in the Gulf of Mexico. I want them to hear Sherry White Williamson and connect dots between what they're doing and the problem that they're working on. So that's Unconfined. Something else I'm doing that I'm really excited about is we have launched a journalism fellowship. It's annual. We launched it in 2024. We're already planning for 2025. And what we do is we gather early and mid-career journalists, and we're going to have an open call for applications coming out here pretty soon. We gather 8 fellows every year. So we have a 2-day intensive here in Baltimore. And then a 3rd day, we go out to the Eastern Shore, which is very close to us here in Baltimore. This is the Delmarva Peninsula, parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. And it's one of the global capitals of industrial chicken production. They do an incredible amount of chicken there. So the first year we talked to a woman who is a healthcare practitioner. She's a nurse practitioner for Haitian immigrant communities that work in these plants. And we actually were able to hear from a couple of workers, recent Haitian immigrants, who had been injured on the plant and treated like garbage, essentially, by these companies. And the idea is to, show these journalists that and show them the huge amount of story ideas, things that there are to write about in this field. And then in the meantime, involved in various writing projects and also policy work here at the center.
It's so big, this problem.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's just so massive. I know you can talk about every aspect of it pretty much, Tom, but since we're going to narrow it down just to workers, which is its own big, massive, huge travesty, let's start with COVID and go from there, because I think most of the world never thought about meatpacking workers or people who work in slaughterhouses or any of it until there was a little bit of exposure during COVID. And that's kind of the first time I think most people ever even thought, where does my meat come from? So will you talk about what actually happened during COVID and why it became such a disaster?
Yeah, and I think it's actually impossible to fully understand what happened until we go back a little bit before COVID. So what we have here is an industry In the U.S., the big three species are hogs, cows, and chickens. You can throw in turkeys there too, under the rubric of poultry. We produce an incredible amount of these three things. We're neck and neck with Brazil for the biggest producers in the world. And the model that we innovated here is the model that they're using in Brazil. It's a sort of mass production and mass confinement of these animals. And if you grow them in huge concentrations like that, then you need to slaughter and pack them in huge concentrations. So we get these really, really big slaughterhouses. And the thing about the industry is that it is a very, in some ways competitive, but it's a very price conscious industry because it's basically selling into giant buyers like Walmart who put a tremendous amount of downward pressure on the prices for chicken and beef and pork. And so what that means is that these companies, to be profitable, they need to squeeze costs wherever they can, and their biggest cost is labor, and so they squeeze workers really hard. And I think there's a racist legacy in that the work traditionally was done by immigrants and people of color. Really, it's a new industry. It basically starts at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century. And it's this sort of idea of, mass producing meat in a few giant slaughterhouses is really only that old, 125 years or something like that. The whole time it's been the most exploitable workers in the food system. And I think that there has been a push to basically let the meat companies operate with very minimal intervention, very minimal regulation. Now, there was this golden age in the middle of the century when union organizing actually made meatpacking work essentially a middle-class job. By 1950, a meatpacking worker is making about the same as a regular industrial worker. And so if you're a meatpacking worker at mid-century, you could live a middle-class life. You could maybe buy a house or at least have a decent place to live. You could participate in the middle class of American life. And what happens in the decades after that are, a major push to attack unions. And basically, there's some big cases that happen in the mid-1980s. Hormel essentially is able to bust its union in Iowa and Minnesota. And then you get the rise of chicken as an everyday thing to eat. And antibiotics are involved with that. You feed animals antibiotics, they grow a lot faster. You can do it more efficiently. At least that worked out like that for a while. So you see this explosion in chicken production. And what the industry does is it cites most of its big production areas are in the right to work states of the Mid-South. And so you get this very low union density, especially in poultry. So they don't have the protection of unions. And then you get the industry flexing its muscle and basically, and this is probably too long of a story for this podcast, 1972, you get the OSHA law, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And OSHA is this agency in the Department of Labor that's tasked with making sure workplaces are safe. And already by the late 90s, it was clear that workers in this industry were routinely getting repetitive motion injuries. And so the meatpacking lobby, along with other industrial lobbies, beats back an effort for OSHA to really regulate this. And so essentially this whole class of workers, it's about 500,000 workers work in meatpacking plants, are essentially effectively taken out of the OSHA system. OSHA has very low resources. It doesn't have resources to inspect the plants. And so you get incredibly high injury rates. You get a workforce that is basically subjected to these repetitive tasks that aren't modified to protect their bodies. And so skyrocketing rates of repetitive stress injuries that these workers deal with. Something else that happens is that especially the chicken industry gets bigger and bigger, because they're processing birds so fast, 140 birds a minute is how fast the kill line goes, that they're having to essentially douse them with antimicrobial chemicals. And these are just sort of like, think about, stuff related to bleach, to to kill these sort of pathogens, these, in fact, antibiotic resistant pathogens that are on this meat. And the workers are just breathing all of this in and just subjected to these really awful working conditions. And one thing that you see is that the median wage of workers goes from about, in just sort of manufacturing average mid-century, to significantly lower than it becomes no longer an industry where you can have a middle-class lifestyle. It becomes an industry where you're essentially destined to be a working poor person. This is all pre-pandemic. We should also say that about a third of the people who work in the industry, I think by the best estimates, are undocumented. In some places, a lot higher than that, depending on where you go. The other thing that we should talk about is the industry becomes, the jobs become so awful and so low paid and so much sort of pain and suffering built into them that the industry is increasingly desperate for new sources of workers. And so you get this refugee to meatpacking plant pipeline. Some of the most desperate people in the world become key parts of the workforce. So these are, documented legal workers, but they're refugees who know that they have very little, they don't speak the language, yeah. They have very few other opportunities, and they become perfect for this industry to exploit. And then you also get convict leasing, literal prison. There are places where prisoners work in meatpacking plants, which is an incredibly cheap form of labor.
I think one other thing I'm just going to throw on there is it's a really hidden industry. Like nobody's paying attention and nobody can even get in there to pay attention.
That's exactly right. It's very secretive. They have the excuse of sort of like biohazards. Like you can't come to our slaughterhouse because you might track in some pathogen that could get in here. So it's all taking place off stage, and it's concentrated in places like Eastern North Carolina, which is the lowest income part of North Carolina, the Delmarva Peninsula here, outside of Baltimore, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. It's in the rural areas of those places. Then sort of for the hog industry, in addition to North Carolina, sort of classic quote-unquote flyover country, rural counties in Iowa, places that are very, very easy to avoid. It's interesting, both Eastern North Carolina, which is sort of one of the epicenters of hog production, and Delmarva with his chickens, they're both on the way to the beach. On the way to beaches that's, here people from Baltimore and DC go, and also from up in Pennsylvania. In North Carolina, the whole state, not the Outer Banks so much, but the lower beaches, sort of South Carolina border, you pass right through CAFO country, but on a giant highway, like a interstate highway. So even then, you don't really, it's almost like sort of an internal vision and a ground-based vision of flyover country.
Right.
Like you might get a whiff at a gas station or something, but yeah, you're right. It's very, very invisible. And, these are communities that the people who work there, maybe they don't speak English. Maybe they're scared of, their documentation status. And so they tend to maintain a very low profile.
We're going to take some of this apart before we go forward, starting with line speed. Because when you say 100, what'd you say, a minute?
140 birds a minute.
Right. 140 birds a minute. To think about that for a second,
yeah,
that's a lot of birds.
It's a lot of birds. And I should say that USDA has been experimenting for a long time with allowing it to boost up to 175 birds a minute, which is a 25% increase. And it was doing it on a sort of experimental level. And the Trump administration greatly expanded the ability to speed up your kill line to 175 birds a minute because 140 wasn't fast enough.
And then it got pulled back?
No, it's still there.
It's still 175.
As far as I know, the Biden administration hasn't pulled any of that back. The catastrophe of the pandemic did not change that.
It didn't really change a lot. Talk about what it looks like for these workers, where they're working and what they're doing. Because I know it's repetitive motion, but the actual facilities and the actual dangers going on.
You'll have one person whose job is cutting the wing off the body of the chicken, making a slash and cut over and over again. And often in a way where they can't keep their wrists straight. They're having to bend their wrists and move it at odd angles.
Yeah.
And they'll be doing that for an 8-hour shift. And so they've basically taken the job of breaking down a chicken and made it into like 8 or 10 different jobs. And people do those jobs over and over again. And they do it, this really kind of was laid bare during COVID. They do it literally shoulder to shoulder. So the section will have like maybe 8 people, and the birds are coming by and they're pulling them off and making that one cut, dropping the wing into one bag, putting the carcass back on the line to go down to the next section. And so, yes, you got people swinging around sharp knives. There are lots of cuts that happen. There are lots of machines that people operate that can be very dangerous. The rates of dismemberment are really high in this industry still. And something else we should set the scene with, and this was well known before the pandemic, is that in many cases, the line is moving so fast and the company, its profits are basically geared toward how many chickens it can slaughter in a day and get out. The more it can do, the higher its profit margins are. And so it wants to keep that line going. And so workers have complained for decades now about their ability to take a bathroom break. I think it's essentially a human right. If I have to go to the bathroom, no one should tell me, no, you can't do that. This is something that happens in this industry. There are very credible anecdotes that have been documented of people wearing diapers to work to avoid having to go to the bathroom. There are stories of women, pregnant women having birth complications from not being able to go to the bathroom. This is the kind of atmosphere that we're looking at, where just the basic ability to take care of your human needs is in question.
And the stress of like the speed and the stress, and you can't be the person that messes it all up. Right?
Yeah. And so you got this incredible speed happening. You've got these really strong smells of not necessarily of like eviscerated animal smells, but like just bleach, just these really strong caustic chemical smells happening.
And so often, though, when people will get hurt or injured or have like a repetitive arm injury, and if they go to their boss, like what happens?
This is a great question, because what happens is, and I just want to give a quick plug to a book that came out in 2024 that is called The Life and Death of the American Worker by Alice Driver. And it's about poultry workers in Arkansas. She does a really good job in there of talking about how it's, basically company-based healthcare. So you go to the healthcare practitioner in the company, there's a nurse on staff, and you say, my arm, I can't feel my wrist, or my wrist was aching all last night and I couldn't sleep. And they will literally just sort of string you along with aspirin and Tylenol. Because if you just give aspirin or render first aid, like you slap a Band-Aid on something, then it doesn't count as an injury. They do a really good job of sort of stringing workers along to hold down injury rates. And then, something else that we should talk about is this job essentially consumes workers. It makes it impossible to work anymore. And so there's a really high turnover rate. And that's what makes it so necessary for the industry to be like, oh, can we get some convicts on here? Oh, are there some Syrian refugees that just had their community bombed out and we've accepted them as refugees? Can we get them into our plant now? Because the turnover rate is so very, very high. But yeah, the company-related healthcare is pretty scandalous, and I suggest everyone to have a look at that book.
Yeah.
And Alice Driver actually published an article on Civil Leads about it too, about the company nurses. So you Google Alice Driver Civil Leads.
And so pretty much, though, if they go and have a real injury, like if an injury stops you from being able to be as fast as everybody else, then you're kind of no good at that point.
Exactly. Right? And they might find another place on the line for you and some other job, or you just can't work there anymore. They're done with you.
And so people don't complain.
They don't feel empowered to complain. They don't feel like I said, unit density is really low.
So, it wasn't surprising what happened during COVID when all of this got super exposed. And then these big meat companies allowed their workers to like just work and get sick and infect their families and their communities.
Yeah. Long story short, that's what that is what happened. And I should also note here that if you Google Human Rights Watch and meatpacking, they put a report out in 2005 called Blood, Sweat, and Fear about U.S. meatpacking. And then they put another report out in 2019 that has an equally, just before the pandemic, it came out like fall of 2019. It has an equally stark title that I'm not remembering right now, but these two reports come out 15 years apart and lay all this bare. And so nothing that happens in the pandemic is a surprise at all to anyone who's watched it, including OSHA people. There were no surprises because it was essentially a chronicle of a human catastrophe foretold.
Yeah.
Like, it was all out there.
Well, and anyone who saw footage during the pandemic and you saw like inside, some of the meatpacking plants and how close together people were and the misery.
Yeah.
Right? You would have thought like that exposure, you would have thought that might have changed something.
Yeah.
But nothing changed.
I wish I could say different, but essentially nothing changed. And, from my perspective, there was an incredible outpouring of great journalism during the pandemic. The industry got way more attention in that, the first year of the pandemic than it had gotten in my time covering it combined. And what do we have to show for it? Well, I do remember when Biden was campaigning in 2020, when he's the nominee, he, in an interview, said that, what happened to meatpacking workers under the Trump administration is unacceptable. I'm paraphrasing here. They made a cheap hamburger more important than human lives. We're going to fix that when I'm in office. And I am, I regret to say that he didn't do much, that the Department of Labor didn't come in and examine what's happening on meatpacking plants and protect workers. The USDA did not move in its authority to adjust line speeds to make them more acceptable to workers. Basically, from a regulatory perspective, the pandemic ended and attention on it ended, and we're back where we started from. But let me just interject I am going to inject some hope into this question in a second with regard to Arkansas. Okay. But it's
a one-off.
It's a one-off. And it's something that I'm hoping we see grow going forward. Yeah, so there is a worker center in Springdale, Arkansas called Venceremos, which means we will win in Spanish. And it is doing some really innovative things in organizing workers and advocating for workers to sort of take control of this narrative and get some more power in the system. And it's run by this woman named Magali Licoli, or I think she pronounces the K hard, so Magali Licoli. And she is our second or third guest on Confined podcast, so you should look that up. She's incredible. But basically, what she's doing there is that, so in the absence of unions, you have what are called worker centers. And this is where, we have them in construction, we have them in different parts of the economy where there are a lot of labor violations happen and workers don't have access to unions. In the meatpacking world, this is what an analysis I got from Magali. Basically, these worker centers were very much behind the scenes, not causing any public fuss, lobbying OSHA, lobbying Department of Labor, lobbying USDA to make things better for workers. But it was all very quiet, and workers were just maybe hauled out to testify at a congressional hearing once in a while, but they were off to the side.
Yeah.
And she worked for a traditional worker center in Arkansas for a while. She's a Mexican national. She came to the United States, not to work in meatpacking plants, but I think she married an American and came over. And she was working in a worker center in Arkansas and just got frustrated with how docile everyone was. And so she broke off, got involved with a couple of workers this is Tyson, the giant meat company. This is where their sort of headquarters is or a bunch of their plants are, and started organizing workers and putting their voices, making them central to to this struggle for dignity and a safe workplace. And I actually met her during the pandemic because I was wanting to talk to workers and quote workers, and it's really, really difficult, especially if you can't really be in person. And if you show up at a parking lot of a meatpacking plant, it's like, who is this guy? Is he from the company? You're not going to get very far.
Nobody's going to trust you.
And so Magali, I had heard about what she's doing, and I called her up, and within a day, I was talking to a worker, and she is working to make sure that workers' voices are at the center of any kind of reform movement. And her model is the coalition of Immokalee workers. And this is a worker center in Florida, in tomato country, where they have basically gotten the insight that if they want to make changes and, raise wages in this place where labor abuses were just incredibly rife 20 years ago, what we need to do is we need to hit the companies that are buying the tomatoes. And so they went and basically boycotted McDonald's and Wendy's and all these different fast food joints. And they got a substantial pay raise. And most importantly, they got a code of conduct that growers have to sign, or these giant buyers aren't going to buy their tomatoes. And she's working on a similar strategy. And the thing about the CIW, Coalition of Immokalee Workers, is so important is that workers are at the center of it. So when they're coming up with a code of conduct, it isn't some guy in a suit or some, guy from a think tank like me who's saying what should happen. It's the workers. Like, what are your problems? What would be fair to you? And that's all in their code of conduct. And the sort of manager of the shift and the tomato plant has to treat the workers with respect. And if they don't, the workers can make a complaint to CIW. It goes into a process, and there is consequences if a manager is like being mean to the workers, that's like being mean is sort of like the baseline, but we're talking about sexual abuse and things like that. There is now a process where workers can get redress, and there's incentives for the growers to not get involved with that process. And so working conditions have changed. And so Magali and Venceremos are at the very start of the process of building that kind of thing in poultry, but putting workers
in Arkansas, though, right?
Yeah, it's in Arkansas, but I think she's hoping for other worker centers to see that they're having an impact, and maybe they'll start doing things differently as well.
Yeah.
But right now it's just in Arkansas. And, it's embattled. It's really hard because, like I said, turnover's fast. You've got all these different languages spoken in a meatpacking plant. It just takes years and years to build up the trust. I don't want to say this is going to transform things, even in Arkansas, overnight. But it's a long process that starts with centering workers' voices.
Right. It's a step.
Yeah.
It's a big step.
It's a big step.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
everyone should know about Venceremos.
Right. But it still feels like it should be more people's responsibility than workers. I know there's a lot of unjust places in the USA where workers are treated really badly.
Yeah.
But not like meat packers. Like,
It's up there.
it's really up there.
Yeah.
And like the physical damage that happens to them. It's not just it's mean and it's abusive and all the other things, but they're also getting hurt and they're losing hands or fingers and getting superbugs.
Exactly.
It's overwhelmingly big. I can't remember if this was during COVID or after, but cases of having underage kids work there in these horrific places and getting hurt and some even killed.
Oh my God. Yeah, it is so bad and so terrible. But and here I'm gonna shout out the work of Hannah Dreier, a New York Times reporter,
Okay.
who I believe won a Pulitzer this year for her work on that very question. And it's the main industries are meatpacking and roofing. This really takes us back to the question of high turnover, how it's a job that's so low paid that it's really hard to get people to do it. But especially in the overnight cleanup crews, we are seeing cases of 13-year-olds working on these crews.
Oh my God.
And then, one of the ways it gets found out is the kids literally falling asleep in class, and the teacher does some investigation, just asking the kid, oh yeah, maybe the kid tries to lie about it, but it turns out that they spent the last night cleaning up a slaughterhouse floor or cleaning machines in a slaughterhouse. I mean, just some of the worst people in the world are supporting it, like the governor of Arkansas, who is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who was a spokesperson for Trump, the daughter of Mike Huckabee. She's now the governor of Arkansas, and she has pushed through a bill lightening restrictions on child labor. Why would she do that in Arkansas? Well, there's a big poultry industry there. These southern states, there is a bit of a plantation mentality that I think still holds a lot of times. There is that idea that, oh yeah, these people should be doing this kind of work. Another place where that's taken hold is Iowa. You're not going to find me at a Kim Reynolds, she's the governor of Iowa, at one of her fan club meetings. She's a very sort of MAGA, Trumpy Republican. And Iowa's got a huge meatpacking industry. And she has also pushed through a bill lightening the regulations on using child labor. This is something that I think that under a Democratic administration in the next 4 years, maybe with pressure from the New York Times and other advocacy, we could maybe have a voice in the Department of Labor for cracking down on this, for doing something about it. But now we have Trump coming to office. And so we have a situation where the industry is desperate for labor. And, we've got enthusiasm, I think, from the industry and some of its politicians to increase the supply of child labor. So, yeah, it's a huge problem going forward. Wow. And it is utterly shocking when you kind of have a sort of narrative of progress in your head as an American, that, here we are revisiting the question of child labor in
meatpacking plants where people are getting like their hands cut off and peeing their pants because they can't go to the bathroom. It sounds like a story from like the 1700s.
Yeah, it's out of Angles in the English working class in the 19th century or something.
Yeah, it totally does. And so because we're about to re-enter another 4 years with Trump, and Trump's been particularly bad for people who want to change the food system and like climate-wise, human health-wise, all the reasons for workers' sake. But now there's going to be a lot more setbacks. What's your take on how we do these 4 years in terms of looking at all that?
Great question. I mean, I think that a lot of environmental and worker regulation is going to have to come down to the states. And that's, that's not great either, because there are still a lot of, there's obviously a lot of red states, and a lot of this industry is in red states. But, one example that's a tiny bit off of our topic is a heat standard for people who work outdoors. There's no heat standard for people who work out. There's no national heat standard. And as climate change continues, and as we get these hotter and hotter summers, there's a lot of farm workers out there working in really hot weather, and it can be very destructive. Even if you don't die of heat stroke, just that amount of sweating can be really hard on your kidneys. I think there's a big association with kidney disease and working under too hot conditions. And the Biden administration was trying to push through a national heat standard. It's a big rule-making process that takes years. That effort is obviously dead in the water. But some states have taken it up. Many states in the West Coast have them. California has one. Up in the Pacific Northwest, Washington and Oregon have them. Maryland passed one where we're speaking from now, I think just this year, that's going into effect. And so that kind of thing. And unfortunately, most meatpacking happens in red states. And also, even when it doesn't, state government ends up being so tied to the industry. North Carolina has had a Democratic governor for a little while now. I don't think he's tried very hard, but he can't push through. He governs in such a tight margin in his legislative bodies that he can't really push anything through. And the pork industry still has huge sway in North Carolina. So even a semi-blue state like that. But I just think local organizing is going to have to be the way. And I think that, people in the animal welfare world, I think, should broaden their purview to the human parts of it and sort of work in coalition. I think it's a potentially big leverage point Like if you can really expose the labor conditions, you're weakening the industry. And if you can increase labor regulations, if you can make it to where workers don't, routinely get repetitive stress injuries, if they're not breathing in harsh chemicals, if you slow the kill line down, that hits their profits, and you are weakening the industry. And also just, remember that, this industry doesn't slaughter, I don't know how many billions of animals. It doesn't just slaughter billions of animals a year. It also makes life hell for the people who work in it, and expand your level of solidarity to those people.
I have one more question for you, and that is about, again, because we're going into Trump years. And one of the first things he's saying he's going to do is mass deportation. And since so many illegal immigrants work in meatpacking plants, do you think that is a place they will go because it's an easy way to get a lot of people at once? But what happens then to those places?
I mean, I think you kind of get to the heart of the contradictions of Trumpism. Yes. And I think those contradictions were on display in the first term because this crackdown on immigration. I mean, the administration doesn't want to just crack down on undocumented immigration. They also want to crack down on documented, legal immigration. They want to crack down on refugees. They want us to take far fewer refugees. And so in all these different ways, you're hitting the labor pool of big ag, not just meatpacking companies, but also, large buyers of fruits and vegetables. This entire the entire food system labor force, restaurants, big restaurant chains. You're attacking their labor force. You're making labor more scarce for them, and you're putting, you're hitting their costs. So on the one hand, they've got their commitment to making lives as miserable as possible for the people who feed us. On the other hand, they're very tight with the meatpacking industry. The meatpacking industry, I haven't looked at the numbers for 2024, but in 2020, the meatpacking industry greatly favored Trump over Biden in terms of campaign finance cash.
Yeah.
And I think they were thinking about the deregulation and kill lines and things like that. They weren't thinking so much about their labor force. And, if Trump really does organize a mass deportation, he's going to have to target meatpacking in places like North Carolina, Iowa, Arkansas, Delmarva. And it's gonna result in. I think I would not be the first to say that this policy is extremely inflationary. If Americans are upset, that they're paying higher prices for food, this is going to increase prices for food. I mean, we're kind of in uncharted territory. They didn't have the sort of administrative capacity or intelligence or knowledge in the first term to do this kind of thing. Supposedly, someone like Stephen Miller has been spending the last 4 years. This is Trump's big advisor on immigration policy. And he is, supposedly, really ready to do this. He's worked out, what has to happen in the various agencies to make this happen. And if he does, there is going to be a lot of chaos and pushback from consumers paying higher prices for meat, and from these sort of giant companies that have come to rely on this for profit. Like, the Tyson family, a Tyson executive, literally wrote the executive order that Trump put into place in 2020 to help keep meatpacking plants going despite this catastrophe happening in meatpacking plants. This is a very tight relationship.
Sure.
How is that going to play out in 2025 when this begins? I have no idea. But one thing I can tell you is we at CLF will be watching and thinking and analyzing and writing about it. And from a perspective of solidarity not with the giant companies, but with the people that are at the wrong end of it.
I'm glad you will. Well, Tom, thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for all the work you do and have done to expose and bring to light so many of these issues.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
To To learn more about Tom and to learn more about the Center for a Livable Future and to check out the Unconfined podcast, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I'd like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polky-Link, Bethany Jones, Sierra Dolan, and Anna Kolner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.